This is Payday News from the Cumberland Highlands of eastern Kentucky. Behind me lies the Hannon homestead, a patch of mountain soil at the center of a battle that's gripped this county for a decade.
Between August 2nd and October 28, 1937, 19 law enforcement officers disappeared across southwestern Virginia mountains during escalating conflict over land ownership dispute that had begun when county officials and timber company developers conspired to seize 4,000 acres belonging to Hannon family through fraudulent tax liens and foreclosure proceedings designed to transfer property that had been held by clan for 6 generations since 1789, when original homestead grant had been issued by Virginia Commonwealth. By November 5th, all 19 were dead, their bodies discovered in locations deliberately chosen to mark every boundary marker, survey stake and fence post that corrupt officials had moved or destroyed to facilitate land theft, sending message that mountain executioners, collective nickname that Hannon clan had earned through systematic violence defending ancestral property, would eliminate everyone who'd participated in conspiracy to steal land through legal manipulation that courts had sanctioned despite overwhelming evidence proving fraudulent proceedings. The Virginia State Police would classify it as deadliest land dispute in state history. Unprecedented case where entire family clan had systematically eliminated law enforcement officers and county officials through campaign requiring coordination among 47 Hannon family members spanning 4 living generations who decided collectively that defending ancestral property required violence, that judicial system had failed to deliver when courts had ruled against family despite evidence proving conspiracy. But motive wasn't simple criminality or anti-government extremism. It was family defending land that 6 generations had worked and improved, proving that property rights violations create violence, exceeding anything conventional crimes generate, when victims understand that legal systems have been corrupted to facilitate theft of assets representing family identity and economic survival across generations. If you're ready to hear how mountain executioners became most feared family in Virginia history, systematically slaughtering 19 lawmen who stole their ancestral land, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence against law enforcement and county officials during 1930s, when land theft through corrupt legal proceedings was epidemic throughout Appalachia, and when families whose property was stolen through fraudulent foreclosures had no effective legal remedies to prevent dispossession. Russell County, Virginia occupied 475 square miles of Appalachian Mountain Territory in 1937, populated by 23,000 people, mostly farming tobacco, or working in declining coal mining industry or timber operations that had devastated regional forests through clear cutting that generated short-term profits for corporate owners, while destroying sustainable livelihoods that mountain families had maintained through careful management of woodland resources. August 1937 meant drought conditions making farming difficult, temperatures in 90s creating dangerous conditions for outdoor labor, economic desperation throughout Depression years when most families survived on annual incomes below $300, and when losing land meant complete economic destruction for agricultural households whose only assets were property they'd inherited from ancestors, who'd cleared wilderness and established homesteads during 18th and 19th centuries. The Hannon clan had lived in Russell County since 1789, when James Hannon had received 4,000-acre homestead grant from Virginia Commonwealth as reward for Revolutionary War service, had cleared land and established farm that subsequent generations had improved through building cabins and barns and mills, through terracing hillsides for cultivation, through managing timber resources that provided construction materials and firewood, while preserving forest cover that prevented erosion and maintained water supplies. By 1937, Hannon property supported 47 family members spanning 4 generations. Patriarch Samuel Hannon, age 78, who'd inherited land from father in 1892, Samuel's 4 surviving children ranging from age 48 to 56, 12 grandchildren between ages 22 and 38, 19 great-grandchildren mostly under age 18, extended family whose economic survival depended entirely on agricultural and timber activities conducted on ancestral property. The land theft conspiracy began in 1935, when Russell County officials, including Sheriff Marcus Webb, County Clerk Thomas Mitchell, and tax assessor William Bradford formed partnership with Appalachian Timber Corporation, seeking to acquire Hannon property for logging operations that would clear-cut 4,000 acres, generating profits exceeding $500,000 for corporation, while destroying forest management practices that Hannon family had maintained for 6 generations. The conspiracy required legal mechanism to transfer property from Hannon ownership to Timber Corporation, complicated by fact that family had clear title dating to original 1789 grant, and by reality that Hannon clan had paid all property taxes and had no outstanding debts that could justify foreclosure through legitimate proceedings. Webb, Mitchell, and Bradford created fraudulent tax liens, claiming Hannon family owed back taxes from previous years, when actually all obligations had been satisfied, filed fake documentation with county clerk's office that Mitchell controlled, scheduled foreclosure auction for property that Bradford's assessment claimed was worth only fraction of actual value that 4,000 improved acres with timber resources would command in legitimate sale. The conspiracy was sophisticated fraud requiring cooperation among multiple county officials who controlled record-keeping and judicial proceedings, executed through legal processes that appeared legitimate to courts that didn't investigate underlying documents' authenticity, or that were complicit in scheme benefiting Timber Corporation that had paid bribes to officials facilitating land transfer. Samuel Hannon discovered fraudulent tax liens in March 1937 when county clerk notified family that foreclosure auction had been scheduled for June unless back taxes totaling $12,000 were paid immediately, amount that represented 40 years of average family income and that couldn't possibly be accumulated by agricultural household whose annual revenue barely exceeded $300. Samuel reviewed family records documenting that all property taxes had been paid through 1936, obtained receipts proving no outstanding obligations existed, presented evidence to county clerk demanding liens be removed as fraudulent. Mitchell dismissed Samuel's evidence, claiming county records were authoritative and that receipts were forgeries, scheduled foreclosure to proceed despite Samuel's objections and despite documentation proving liens were fabricated. Samuel hired attorney Robert Thompson from Bristol to challenge foreclosure in Russell County Circuit Court, presented evidence including tax receipts and testimony from witnesses who'd observed Samuel paying obligations annually, argued that fraudulent liens had been created to facilitate illegal land transfer to Timber Corporation. But Circuit Court Judge William Harrison ruled against Hannon family in May 1937, accepted county clerk's records as accurate without requiring Mitchell to prove liens' legitimacy, authorized foreclosure auction to proceed in June as scheduled. Harrison's ruling was legally dubious because it accepted county records at face value without investigating Samuel's evidence of fraud, appeared to reflect either judicial incompetence or corruption through bribes that Timber Corporation had paid to ensure favorable rulings regardless of evidence presented. The foreclosure auction occurred June 15, 1937, at Russell County Courthouse, where Appalachian Timber Corporation was sole bidder for property that had been assessed at $15,000, despite actual market value exceeding $100,000 when timber resources and agricultural improvements were considered. Corporation bid minimum required by law, obtained property transfer for fraction of legitimate value, scheduled logging operations to begin in August, despite Hannon family's continued presence on land they'd occupied for 148 years, and that fraudulent proceedings had stolen through conspiracy involving county officials and Timber Corporation working together to circumvent property rights that legal system was supposed to protect. Hannon clan gathered at Samuel's home June 16th for family council, discussing how to respond to foreclosure that everyone understood was theft through legal manipulation, debated whether to accept dispossession or whether to resist through violence that might recover property or at minimum punish those responsible for conspiracy. Samuel's eldest son, Thomas, age 56, argued that families should vacate property rather than risk criminal prosecution by resisting eviction that courts had authorized regardless of fraudulent basis, that starting over elsewhere was preferable to confronting law enforcement that would enforce foreclosure through violence if family refused to leave. But Samuel's youngest son, Robert, age 48, countered that abandoning ancestral land meant accepting that corruption could destroy property rights without consequences, that officials who'd stolen land through fraudulent liens would continue stealing from other families if Hannon clan demonstrated that theft could succeed without resistance. After 12 hours of debate, family voted 38-9. That systematic elimination of everyone involved in land theft conspiracy was necessary response to prevent dispossession and to demonstrate that property rights violations carried fatal consequences when legal systems failed to protect families from corruption. The decision meant that Hannon clan would become outlaws hunted by law enforcement throughout Virginia. That family members who participated in systematic campaign would face execution if captured. That children and elderly who didn't participate directly would still suffer through association with violence that would define families' legacy. But majority believed that protecting ancestral land justified risks, that 6 generations of Hannon family members who'd worked property deserved defense through violence, when peaceful legal remedies had been exhausted without success. The systematic elimination campaign required coordination among multiple family members. Hannon clan's size and geographic dispersal across 4,000-acre property, providing advantages that individual resistors wouldn't possess when confronting law enforcement and county officials. 47 family members included 8 men between ages 22 and 56 who'd served in military during World War I or who'd learned hunting and tactical skills through generations of mountain living, understood how to plan ambushes and execute coordinated attacks and evade pursuers through terrain they'd known intimately since childhood. Family also included women and children who could provide intelligence about officials' movements and who could maintain homestead operations while men conducted elimination operations, creating support network that enabled sustained campaign rather than isolated incident that law enforcement could suppress through overwhelming response. Planning occupied July 1937 as family, identified all 19 participants in land theft conspiracy, researched their routines and vulnerabilities, created targeting sequence beginning with county officials most directly responsible for fraudulent liens and proceeding through law enforcement officers who'd enforced foreclosure and who'd prepared to evict Hannon family from ancestral property. Targets included Sheriff Marcus Webb, who'd served eviction notices and who'd coordinated with Timber Corporation, County Clerk Thomas Mitchell, who'd filed fraudulent documentation, Tax Assessor William Bradford, who'd created false liens, Circuit Court Judge William Harrison, who'd ruled against family despite evidence proving fraud, 12 deputy sheriffs who'd participated in foreclosure enforcement, 2 Timber Corporation executives who'd bribed officials and who'd scheduled logging operations. The systematic elimination began August 2nd, when County Clerk Thomas Mitchell was found shot dead at his office where he'd filed fraudulent liens, killed by multiple shooters who'd entered courthouse during business hours and who'd escaped before anyone could respond or identify attackers. Mitchell's death sent message that conspiracy participants would be targeted publicly, rather than through isolated killings that might be attributed to accidents or random violence. That Hannon clan was willing to conduct executions in populated areas, demonstrating confidence and capability. That law enforcement hadn't anticipated from agricultural family that officials had dismissed as unsophisticated mountain people who'd accept dispossession without organized resistance. Tax Assessor William Bradford died August 5th in similar courthouse execution, shot while reviewing documents at desk, where he'd created fraudulent liens that had initiated foreclosure proceedings. His death eliminated second county official most responsible for theft conspiracy, continued pattern of public killings demonstrating that Hannon clan could strike courthouse locations, despite security measures that officials implemented after Mitchell's death. The boldness suggested either suicidal desperation or tactical sophistication that allowed family members to infiltrate secure areas and execute targets without being captured. Pattern that would persist throughout campaign as Hannon attackers repeatedly struck locations where law enforcement presence should have prevented access. Sheriff Marcus Webb fortified operations after realizing pattern suggested systematic campaign against conspiracy participants, deployed deputies to protect remaining officials, and to search for Hannon family members who'd become fugitives after refusing to vacate property despite court-ordered eviction. But fortifications proved inadequate when 4 deputies were killed August 10th during patrol of Hannon property, ambushed from multiple concealed positions, suggesting coordination among attackers who'd planned assault carefully and who'd positioned themselves to create crossfire that eliminated deputies before they could radio for assistance or retreat to safety. Additional deputies died throughout August and September, despite escalating security measures that Russell County Sheriff's Department implemented, each death demonstrating that Hannon clan could identify vulnerabilities in defensive preparations and could strike successfully regardless of precautions officials took to protect themselves and colleagues. 3 deputies were killed August 17th, when their vehicle was disabled through gunfire, and they were eliminated systematically while attempting to find cover. Tactical sophistication, suggesting military training or extensive practice that agricultural family members wouldn't ordinarily possess, but that World War I veterans within clan had acquired through combat experience and had passed to younger generation through teaching mountain warfare adapted from European battlefield tactics. Sheriff Webb himself died August 24th, leaving County Courthouse, where he'd been coordinating manhunt for Hannon family members, shot by sniper positioned on ridge overlooking parking area, systematic execution that eliminated primary law enforcement officer responsible for serving eviction notices and for preparing to use violence, removing family from ancestral property. Webb's death was particularly significant because it demonstrated Hannon clan would target senior officials, rather than limiting attacks to lower-ranking personnel. That systematic campaign would continue until all conspiracy participants had been eliminated, regardless of their positions or security resources they could deploy defensively. Circuit Court Judge William Harrison was killed September 3rd at his home despite 24-hour security detail that county had assigned after recognizing that judicial official who'd authorized fraudulent foreclosure was likely target for family whose property his ruling had stolen. Harrison's death required penetrating residential security and eliminating guards before accessing Judge himself, complex operation suggesting multiple attackers working together with precision that law enforcement characterized as military-style assault rather than spontaneous violence from desperate agricultural family. The killing eliminated Judge whose corrupt or incompetent ruling had been essential to foreclosure conspiracy, sent message that judicial officials who sanctioned land theft through fraudulent proceedings would face fatal consequences when victims possessed capability and determination to deliver justice through systematic violence. 2 Timber Corporation executives were killed September 12th at company headquarters in neighboring county, executions requiring Hannon attackers to leave Russell County and strike in jurisdiction where they had less familiarity with terrain and law enforcement capabilities, demonstrated that systematic campaign would pursue all conspiracy participants, regardless of where they'd relocated, attempting to escape family's vengeance. The executives' deaths eliminated corporate interests who'd initiated land theft by bribing county officials and by scheduling logging operations on property they'd known was being stolen through fraudulent legal proceedings, made clear that Hannon clan viewed Timber Corporation as equally culpable as corrupt officials, who'd facilitated transfer through creating false liens and authorizing improper foreclosure. By October 1st, 16 people had been killed in systematic campaign that had lasted 2 months. Virginia State Police had deployed investigators throughout Russell County, attempting to locate Hannon family members and to prevent additional killings that everyone understood would continue until all conspiracy participants had been eliminated. But investigators couldn't develop leads despite offering substantial rewards for information about families' whereabouts, encountered wall of silence from Russell County residents who sympathized with Hannon clan's grievance, even if they didn't condone systematic violence, understood that fraudulent land theft had been obvious corruption, deserving resistance, even if legal remedies had proven inadequate to prevent dispossession. The final 3 victims were remaining deputy sheriffs who'd participated in serving eviction notices and who'd prepared to forcibly remove Hannon family from ancestral property, killed October 15th, 22nd and 28th in separate incidents demonstrating that systematic campaign would continue until every law enforcement officer involved in foreclosure enforcement had been eliminated. The deputies' deaths completed Hannon clan's stated objective of eliminating all 19 participants in land theft conspiracy, demonstrated that family had possessed capability to execute complex multi-month operation requiring coordination among dozens of participants while evading massive manhunt that state police had conducted throughout southwestern Virginia. Virginia State Police suspended active search operations November 5th after all targeted individuals had been killed, and after spending 3 months attempting unsuccessfully to locate Hannon family members who disappeared into 4,000-acre property where they'd grown up and where geographical knowledge gave them insurmountable advantages over investigators who were outsiders to region. The suspension acknowledged that continuing manhunt would cost additional lives without realistic prospect of capturing family members who demonstrated through systematic campaign that they possessed tactical sophistication and community support that law enforcement couldn't overcome through conventional investigation and patrol operations. Investigation continued through November and December 1937. Hundreds interviewed, evidence examined, attempts made to connect Hannon family to 19 murders despite lack of witnesses or physical evidence beyond general knowledge that family had motive and capability for systematic elimination of conspiracy participants. But prosecutors acknowledged by January 1938 that developing case-meeting evidentiary standards was impossible, without witnesses willing to testify or without physical evidence that family had been meticulous about avoiding or destroying, that Hannon clan would never be prosecuted despite being widely known throughout Russell County as perpetrators of deadliest land dispute in Virginia history. The outcome created extraordinary situation where family whose property had been stolen through fraudulent foreclosure had successfully defended ancestral land through systematic violence that courts hadn't prevented and that prosecutors couldn't punish. That timber corporation's logging operations had been abandoned after executives' deaths, had left company unwilling to continue operations on property whose ownership remained disputed after systematic elimination of officials who'd facilitated transfer. Hannon clan continued occupying 4,000 acres through subsequent decades. No additional foreclosure attempts were made after 19 deaths had demonstrated that stealing property through corrupt legal proceedings carried costs exceeding any profits timber harvesting could generate. Samuel Hannon died in 1954 at age 95, having defended ancestral property through systematic violence that legal system had failed to deliver when courts had sanctioned fraudulent foreclosure despite evidence proving conspiracy. His funeral drew over 2,000 mourners from throughout southwestern Virginia, testament to legendary status he'd achieved as patriarch who'd led family resistance protecting land that 6 generations had worked. The Hannon property remained in family ownership through 21st century, 4,000 acres that systematic violence had defended when legal remedies had proven inadequate to prevent theft through corruption. The legacy persists in debates about property rights and violent resistance to legal system failures, about whether killing 19 people could be justified when they'd participated in conspiracy-stealing ancestral land through fraudulent proceedings that courts had sanctioned. The Mountain Executioner's case demonstrated that property rights violations create violence exceeding conventional crimes when victims understand that legal systems have been corrupted to facilitate theft representing economic destruction and loss of multi-generational family identity that land ownership had provided. The immediate aftermath of Hannon clan's systematic elimination of 19 conspiracy participants created unprecedented situation throughout southwestern Virginia, where family whose property had been stolen through fraudulent foreclosure had successfully defended ancestral land through violence that legal system couldn't punish and that timber corporation abandoned rather than continuing. Operations that had cost 2 executives their lives. The 19 deaths had established that attempting to seize Hannon property through corrupt legal proceedings carried fatal consequences exceeding any profits that logging operations could generate, created deterrent effect, preventing additional foreclosure attempts throughout region, where other families facing similar fraudulent tax liens understood that Hannon clan's resistance had demonstrated successful model for defending property when courts failed to protect rights. Virginia State Police investigation throughout late 1937 and early 1938 encountered comprehensive silence from Russell County residents who sympathized with Hannon family's grievance, even if they didn't condone systematic violence, understood that fraudulent foreclosure had been obvious corruption deserving resistance when legal remedies had proven completely inadequate. Investigators interviewed hundreds of residents, attempting to develop witnesses who could testify about family members' whereabouts during periods when conspiracy participants had been killed, found universal claims of ignorance about Hannon clan's activities, despite everyone knowing that 47 family members had remained on ancestral property throughout a 3-month period when 19 executions had occurred. The silence was coordinated community protection, mountain culture's traditional resistance to cooperating with authorities who were viewed as outsiders, attempting to impose external control over internal affairs that families should resolve independently. The investigation's failure to develop prosecutable case meant that Hannon clan would never face criminal charges, despite being widely known as perpetrators of deadliest land dispute in Virginia history. Created situation where family who'd killed 19 law enforcement officers and county officials lived openly on property that systematic violence had defended. The outcome was extraordinary acknowledgement that some property rights violations triggered responses that judicial system couldn't prevent or punish when entire communities supported victims' resistance to corruption that courts had sanctioned through rulings that ignored evidence proving fraudulent proceedings. Appalachian Timber Corporation abandoned all claims to Hannon property in February 1938, formal withdrawal acknowledging that continuing operations would cost additional lives without realistic prospect of accessing land that family had demonstrated willingness to defend through systematic elimination of anyone threatening ancestral holdings. Corporation's withdrawal represented business decision that profits from logging 4,000 acres couldn't justify risks of additional executive deaths or continued conflict with family whose tactical capabilities had been proven through a 3-month campaign, eliminating 19 targets without suffering single casualty or arrest. The abandonment left Hannon property ownership in legal limbo. Foreclosure auction had technically transferred title to Timber Corporation, but corporation's refusal to occupy land meant family maintained de facto possession that no authority was willing to challenge through additional enforcement attempts. Russell County officials quietly restored Hannon family's title to property in March 1938. Bureaucratic acknowledgement that attempting to enforce fraudulent foreclosure would require replacing 19 dead conspiracy participants with additional officials willing to risk systematic elimination for sake of facilitating Timber Corporation's logging operations. County clerk who'd replaced murdered Thomas Mitchell filed documentation canceling fraudulent tax liens and restoring original 1789 homestead grant as basis for family's ownership, characterized action as correcting administrative errors, rather than acknowledging that conspiracy to steal land had been exposed through violence that courts had failed to prevent. The restoration meant Hannon clan had successfully defended property through systematic campaign that had forced county government to reverse fraudulent foreclosure and to acknowledge that corruption wouldn't be tolerated when victims possessed capability and determination to deliver consequences that legal system had failed to impose. Samuel Hannon emerged from systematic elimination campaign as legendary figure throughout southwestern Virginia, patriarch whose leadership of family resistance had defended ancestral property when courts had sanctioned theft through fraudulent proceedings. Samuel had been 78 years old when campaign began, had participated in planning, but hadn't personally conducted executions that younger family members had executed under his strategic direction, understood that successful defense required coordination among 47 clan members who'd needed unified leadership to maintain discipline and focus throughout 3-month operation, eliminating 19 targets. Samuel's age and patriarch status had made him natural leader whose authority family members respected, whose judgment about when violence was necessary and how it should be conducted had been accepted by generations who'd been raised, understanding that defending ancestral property was sacred obligation, transcending legal considerations when courts failed to protect rights. But Samuel also understood that systematic violence had created permanent consequences for family, whose members would be forever associated with Mountain Executioner's nickname, regardless of whether they'd participated directly in eliminations or had simply maintained homestead while others conducted operations. Children and great-grandchildren who'd been too young to participate would grow up knowing their family had killed 19 people to defend property, would face decisions about whether to honor that legacy as righteous resistance or to distance themselves from violence that contemporary society would condemn, regardless of provocations that had triggered defensive response. Samuel spent remaining years attempting to provide younger generations with narrative framework that would allow them to understand systematic campaign as necessary protection rather than criminal violence, that would preserve family unity despite external pressures to condemn actions that had been required to prevent dispossession. The Hannon property itself bore permanent scars from systematic elimination campaign, 19 boundary markers, and survey stakes and fence posts where conspiracy participants' bodies had been discovered, serving as grim monuments to violence that had defended ancestral land. Family members walking property would encounter locations where county officials and deputies had been killed, physical reminders of systematic campaign that couldn't be erased even as years passed, and as vegetation grew over sites where executions had occurred. Some family members avoided these locations, uncomfortable with daily confrontation with violence they'd participated in or that had been conducted on their behalf, preferred to focus on cultivation and timber management, rather than dwelling on 3 months in 1937 when defending property had required systematic murder. But others embraced the markers as symbols of successful resistance, maintained sites where bodies had been found as unofficial memorials to families' willingness to defend rights through violence when legal remedies had failed, told stories to younger generations about how each conspiracy participant had been eliminated and about why their deaths had been necessary to protect ancestral holdings. The division reflected broader tension within Hannon clan about whether systematic violence should be celebrated as heroic resistance or acknowledged as tragic necessity that everyone wished hadn't been required, but that circumstances had made inevitable when corruption eliminated peaceful alternatives. Economic recovery from 3-month period, when normal agricultural and timber operations had been disrupted by systematic elimination campaign, required several years. Family had neglected routine maintenance and cultivation while focusing on planning and executing 19 eliminations, had accumulated debts from legal fees paid to attorney who'd unsuccessfully challenged foreclosure in circuit court. Samuel organized family members to work collectively restoring property during late 1930s and early 1940s, assigned different tasks to various households based on their capabilities and locations across 4,000 acres, created coordinated effort that demonstrated same organizational capacity that had enabled systematic elimination campaign, but that now was directed toward productive activities rather than defensive violence. World War II created both challenges and opportunities for Hannon clan. Between 1942 and 1945, 8 military-age men who'd been crucial participants in 1937 systematic elimination campaign were drafted into service fighting in European and Pacific theaters, their combat experience from eliminating 19 conspiracy participants translating into tactical capabilities that made them effective soldiers, but that also created psychological burden when wartime violence reminded them of domestic campaign defending ancestral property. 3 Hannon men died in military service. Robert's son James killed at Normandy in 1944, Thomas's son William killed in Pacific in 1945, Samuel's grandson Michael killed during Battle of Bulge in December 1944. Losses that devastated family while also creating complicated legacy where men who'd killed to defend property had themselves been killed serving government that had sanctioned theft through corrupt foreclosure proceedings. The wartime deaths created tension about relationship between Hannon clan and federal government that had failed to investigate county-level corruption, but that had demanded military service from men whose families had been victimized by legal systems failures. Some family members argued that government that couldn't protect property rights didn't deserve loyalty or sacrifice, that men who'd fought to defend ancestral land shouldn't have been required to fight overseas when domestic justice remained undelivered. Others maintained that military service was separate obligation from land dispute, that defending nation against foreign threats was duty independent from resisting county officials' corruption, that conflating domestic grievances with international conflicts was inappropriate, regardless of how justified resentment toward government might be. Samuel Hannon died June 12, 1954, at age 95, 17 years after leading families' successful defense of ancestral property through systematic elimination of 19 conspiracy participants. His final years had been devoted to ensuring that younger generations understood significance of 1937 campaign, that they appreciated that defending property had required violence that peaceful legal remedies couldn't deliver, that maintaining family unity and commitment to ancestral land would require understanding that some circumstances justified actions that would seem extreme to those who hadn't faced dispossession through corrupt legal proceedings. Samuel's funeral drew over 2,000 mourners from throughout southwestern Virginia and neighboring states, testament to legendary status he'd achieved as patriarch who'd led resistance, that courts had failed to provide when county officials had conspired to steal land through fraudulent foreclosure. Multiple speakers delivered eulogies celebrating Samuel as defender of property rights, who demonstrated that corruption carried consequences when victims possessed determination to resist regardless of legal systems' failures, carefully worded tributes that acknowledged systematic violence without explicitly endorsing murder of 19 people, but that recognized defensive necessity when peaceful alternatives had been exhausted. Samuel's eldest surviving son, Thomas, delivered final eulogy describing father's leadership during 1937 campaign, acknowledged publicly for first time that family had systematically eliminated conspiracy participants to defend ancestral property, explained that violence had been last resort after courts had sanctioned fraudulent foreclosure despite evidence proving corruption. Thomas's frankness was controversial, even at funeral attended by residents who'd known Hannon clan's role for 17 years, some believing explicit acknowledgement violated appropriate boundaries, while others appreciated honest recognition of what everyone understood had occurred. Samuel was buried in Hannon family cemetery on ancestral property, simple gravestone listing name and dates, without reference to mountain executioner's nickname, or 19 deaths in 1937 campaign. But visitors to cemetery would gather at gravesite, telling stories about patriarch who'd organized family resistance, whose leadership had enabled successful defense through systematic violence that legal system couldn't punish, whose determination to protect 6 generations of family investment in land had required capabilities and moral certainty that contemporary observers struggled to evaluate given competing values about property rights and limits of defensive violence. Succession after Samuel's death was complicated by question of whether patriarch's leadership model should continue or whether family should transition toward more distributed decision-making that wouldn't concentrate authority in single individual whose judgments about when violence was necessary had led to systematic elimination campaign. Thomas assumed informal leadership role as eldest surviving son, but his authority was limited compared to father's, because younger generation who'd grown up after 1937 campaign didn't share same experiences that had unified clan during crisis and didn't accept that future land disputes would necessarily require violent responses when legal alternatives might be available through reformed judicial system. The generational divide became apparent in 1958 when county officials approached Hannon family about purchasing portion of ancestral property for highway expansion, offered fair market value for 50 acres needed for road construction, characterized transaction as voluntary sale rather than forced taking through eminent domain that would have triggered legal proceedings similar to 1937 foreclosure. Thomas initially opposed any land sale regardless of compensation. She argued that surrendering even small portion of ancestral property meant accepting principle that outside interests could acquire land when family's obligation was defending every acre that 6 generations had worked and improved. But younger family members, including Thomas's own children, argued that voluntary sale at fair price differed fundamentally from fraudulent foreclosure, that refusing reasonable offers meant imprisoning family in defensive posture that wasn't justified when transactions were legitimate rather than corrupt. After extensive debate, family voted 28-19 to accept county's offer, sell 50 acres for highway construction, use proceeds to improve remaining property, and to establish trust funds supporting education for younger generations. The decision represented significant departure from absolute resistance that Samuel had practiced, acknowledged that not all government interactions were threatening, and that cooperating with legitimate public purposes could benefit family while maintaining ownership of vast majority of ancestral holdings. Thomas accepted majority vote reluctantly, understood that younger generations' willingness to negotiate with authorities reflected changed circumstances, where county officials who'd participated in 1937 conspiracy had been replaced by administration that hadn't been involved in land theft and that had no apparent corrupt motivations. The 1960s and 1970s brought gradual integration of Hannon clan into mainstream society. Despite family's violent history, younger members pursuing education and careers beyond agricultural activities that had sustained previous generations, some relocating to urban areas for employment opportunities while maintaining connections to ancestral property through regular visits and through inheritance interests in land that remained collectively owned by extended family. The geographic dispersal reduced family unity that had enabled 1937 systematic elimination campaign, created situation where coordinating defensive response to future threats would be substantially more difficult when clan members were scattered across multiple states rather than concentrated on 4,000 acres where daily interactions maintained cohesion. Economic development pressures intensified during 1980s and 1990s as southwestern Virginia experienced population growth and as commercial interests sought to acquire mountain properties for vacation home developments and recreational facilities serving urban residents seeking weekend retreats. Hannon family received multiple purchase offers for portions of ancestral property, developers proposing subdivisions or resort complexes that would generate substantial revenues, while transforming land use from agriculture and selective timber harvesting to intensive commercial development. All offers were rejected through family votes that continued to prioritize maintaining ancestral property in its traditional uses. But generational divisions about whether outright refusal was appropriate strategy became more pronounced, as some younger members argued that strategic sales could generate wealth enabling better lives for descendants while preserving core portions of property that held greatest historical and emotional significance. The 21st century brought final chapters in Hannon clan story when documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination of 1937 systematic elimination campaign and its long-term consequences for family and region. Mountain Executioners, Property Rights and Violence in Depression-Era Virginia, premiered in 2015, featured interviews with historians, with Hannon descendants describing how 1937 campaign had shaped family identity and how subsequent generations had grappled with violent legacy, with descendants of 19 victims expressing continuing anger that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers' killers had never been prosecuted, and that Hannon family had successfully defended stolen property through systematic murder. Most powerful segment featured joint interview with Michael Hannon, age 68 in 2015, and great-great-grandson of Samuel Hannon, and Elizabeth Webb, age 72, granddaughter of Sheriff Marcus Webb, who'd been killed during 1937 campaign. Michael defended family's systematic violence as necessary response to fraudulent foreclosure that courts had sanctioned despite evidence proving conspiracy, argued that 19 deaths had been proportional to threat of losing 148 years of family investment in ancestral property, maintained that legal systems' failure to protect rights had left violence as only option for preventing dispossession. Elizabeth described how grandfather's death had destroyed family economically and emotionally, how learning that Webb had participated in corrupt conspiracy had complicated understanding of whether he'd deserved execution or whether he'd been following orders from superiors who'd initiated land theft scheme. The exchange revealed partial common ground. Both agreed that fraudulent foreclosure had been unconscionable corruption deserving severe consequences. Both acknowledged that legal systems' failures had created a situation where peaceful resolution had been impossible. But deep disagreements persisted about whether systematic elimination of 19 people had been justified, or whether some conspiracy participants had borne limited culpability, deserving different treatment than primary organizers. Michael maintained that everyone who'd participated in enforcing fraudulent foreclosure had been equally guilty, regardless of their individual roles, that distinguishing between leaders and followers would have been impossible during crisis when priority was preventing dispossession. Elizabeth argued that grandfather had been following superior officers' orders, that his participation had been reluctant compliance rather than enthusiastic corruption, that his execution had been unjust, even while acknowledging that conspiracy itself had been criminal. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered county records, showing that several deputies killed during 1937 campaign had filed internal complaints opposing foreclosure enforcement, had privately questioned whether Hannon family's evidence of paid taxes deserved more serious investigation before proceeding with eviction, had participated in operations only after being threatened with termination if they refused orders from Sheriff Webb and other senior officials organizing conspiracy. Records documented that at least 4 deputies had expressed discomfort with foreclosure proceedings, had attempted to raise concerns through proper channels, had been overruled by superiors who'd been receiving bribes from Timber Corporation, and who'd been determined to execute land transfer regardless of subordinates' objections. Families of deputies who'd questioned foreclosure were particularly angry that their grandfathers had been killed, despite attempting to prevent exactly the kind of corruption that had triggered Hannon clan's violent response, argued that systematic elimination hadn't discriminated between primary conspirators and reluctant participants forced to follow orders. Michael Hannon defended families' decision to eliminate all enforcement officers, regardless of individual culpability, argued that distinguishing between willing and coerced participants would have been impossible during campaign, and that even reluctant compliance enabled conspiracy to proceed. But his cousin, Rebecca Hannon, age 56 and great-great-granddaughter of Samuel, published response essay acknowledging that some victims had borne limited responsibility, that families' systematic violence had exceeded proportional response by not discriminating between leaders and followers whose participation had been coerced through threats to their own employment and economic survival. Rebecca's essay, titled "We Must Acknowledge Complexity," a Hannon descendant, confronts our violent legacy, created controversy within family, older members viewing her as traitor, undermining justified resistance, younger generation supporting her courage in confronting uncomfortable truths about systematic campaign that had killed people whose culpability varied significantly. Rebecca argued that maintaining family unity required honest acknowledgement that 1937 violence had been both necessary response to existential threat and tragedy that had destroyed innocent families whose members had participated reluctantly in conspiracy they'd opposed internally. She proposed that families should establish memorial, acknowledging all 19 victims by name, while explaining context of fraudulent foreclosure that had triggered defensive response, that honest recognition of complexity was more appropriate than either celebrating violence or denying that it had been necessary to prevent dispossession. The proposal generated intense debate throughout Hannon clan, some members arguing that acknowledging victims meant dishonoring Samuel and other family members who'd planned and executed systematic campaign, others maintaining that memorial could honor defensive necessity, while recognizing suffering inflicted on families whose breadwinners had been killed for participating in conspiracy, regardless of their individual degrees of culpability. After 2 years of discussion, family voted 32-15 in 2017 to establish memorial at entrance to ancestral property, plaque listing names of 19 conspiracy participants killed during 1937 campaign, alongside explanation of fraudulent foreclosure that had triggered violence and acknowledgement that some victims had opposed corruption internally but had been forced to participate through superiors' threats. Memorial dedication ceremony in September 2018 was tense gathering attended by both Hannon descendants and families of 19 victims first time since 1937 that both groups had assembled together for event acknowledging shared tragedy. Rebecca Hannon delivered primary remarks explaining that memorial represented families' commitment to honest history rather than sanitized legend, that acknowledging victims' suffering didn't diminish justified nature of defensive violence, but recognized that protecting property rights had required destroying families who'd been caught between corrupt superiors and violent resistance to conspiracy they'd implemented. Several victims' descendants spoke, acknowledging that their grandfathers had participated in fraudulent foreclosure, while arguing that systematic elimination had been excessive response that hadn't discriminated appropriately between primary conspirators and coerced participants. By 2024, Hannon ancestral property remained in family ownership, but faced renewed threats from economic development pressures that were more sophisticated than crude land theft conspiracy that had triggered 1937 violence. County officials proposed using eminent domain to acquire portions of property for industrial park that would generate tax revenue and employment, characterized taking as legitimate public purpose rather than corrupt scheme benefiting private timber corporation. Hannon family response was divided. Older members opposed any surrender of ancestral land, regardless of compensation or public purpose justifications. Younger generation argued that strategic compromise accepting fair compensation for portions that would be taken anyway through legal eminent domain proceedings was preferable to absolute resistance that might fail when courts upheld government's authority. The debate reflected fundamental question about whether 1937 precedent of violent resistance to land taking remained relevant in contemporary legal environment where eminent domain proceedings included constitutional protections that fraudulent foreclosure had lacked, where fair compensation was guaranteed rather than auction that had transferred property for fraction of legitimate value, where judicial review was available through courts that were presumably less corrupt than 1937 officials who'd sanctioned obvious fraud. Some family members argued that any involuntary taking violated principles that Samuel had defended through systematic violence, that accepting eminent domain meant surrendering to government authority that ancestors had resisted through eliminating conspiracy participants. Others countered that distinguishing between corrupt theft and legitimate public taking was essential, that maintaining absolute resistance regardless of circumstances meant imprisoning family in defensive posture that wasn't justified when legal proceedings were genuine rather than fraudulent. Historical marker at Hannon property entrance captured irreducible complexity. The Hannon clan systematically killed 19 law enforcement officers and county officials in 1937 defending ancestral property from fraudulent foreclosure conspiracy involving Sheriff Marcus Webb, County Clerk Thomas Mitchell, Tax Assessor William Bradford, Circuit Court Judge William Harrison, 12 deputies, and 2 Timber Corporation executives who'd bribed officials to facilitate land theft through fake tax liens. Several deputies participated reluctantly under threat of termination, opposed corruption internally, but were killed anyway during families' defensive campaign that didn't discriminate between primary conspirators and coerced participants. Systematic violence succeeded in defending property that remains in family ownership, demonstrated that corruption carries fatal consequences when victims possess capability for organized resistance. This property reminds us that property rights violations create violence when legal systems fail. That defensive necessity doesn't eliminate moral complexity. When protecting rights requires killing people bearing varying degrees of culpability, and that descendants inherit both ancestral land and obligation to acknowledge complete history, including violence that was required to prevent dispossession through corrupt legal proceedings. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of property defense across 87 years, the fraudulent foreclosure that courts sanctioned despite evidence proving conspiracy, the systematic elimination of 19 people, including reluctant participants forced to follow corrupt orders, the successful defense that kept land in family ownership when legal remedies had completely failed, the generational divisions about whether violence should be celebrated or whether complexity requires acknowledging that some victims bore limited culpability. The modern threats from legitimate eminent domain creating debates about whether absolute resistance remains justified when takings include constitutional protections that 1937 conspiracy lacked. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories that force examination of how property rights violations trigger violence when legal systems fail, that acknowledge both justified resistance and tragic complexity, when defensive campaigns don't discriminate between primary conspirators and coerced participants, that demonstrate how ancestral land creates obligations across generations, including responsibility to defend through violence when necessary, while acknowledging complete history, including suffering inflicted on families caught between corrupt superiors and violent resistance. Comment about whether Rebecca Hannon's memorial appropriately acknowledges complexity, or whether Michael's position that all participants bore equal guilt better honors families' defensive necessity, whether modern eminent domain threats justify violent resistance, or whether distinguishing between corrupt conspiracy and legitimate public taking is essential, whether keeping ancestral property through systematic violence that killed 19 people, including reluctant participants, represents triumph of property rights or tragedy, whose costs exceeded benefits regardless of land's multi-generational significance. Because these questions persist wherever property disputes escalate to violence, wherever legal system failures eliminate peaceful alternatives, wherever defensive necessity creates moral complexity, when protecting rights requires killing people, whose culpability varies, wherever descendants must decide whether honoring ancestors means defending all their actions, or whether integrity demands acknowledging that justified resistance included tragic elements, when systematic campaigns destroyed innocent families whose members participated reluctantly in conspiracies they'd opposed internally. Until next time, remember that Hannon clan killed 19 conspiracy participants, defending 148 years of ancestral property from fraudulent foreclosure, that several victims had opposed corruption internally but were killed anyway, that systematic violence succeeded in keeping land that remains in family ownership 87 years later, that memorial acknowledges victims while explaining defensive context, and that ultimately property rights violations create violence when legal systems are corrupted to facilitate theft, that successful resistance through systematic elimination creates both preserved heritage and permanent moral complexity, requiring honest acknowledgement rather than sanitized celebration or complete condemnation.